A mathematician built equation in 1971, not on a computer, not on paper, extracted from a 3,000-year-old oracle that had mapped human destiny for millennia. The equation didn't stop running when its creator died. And right now, in the exact window it points toward, something is happening. What he discovered wasn't a prophecy. It was a mathematical inevitability. And here's what almost nobody talks about. In the final months before his death, McKenna described one specific consequence of the equation's terminal point, something that made even him afraid. That information has been circulating privately among his closest collaborators for 25 years. You're about to hear it. If you're ready for an uncomfortable truth that lives somewhere between mathematics and something we don't have a word for yet, stay until the end. This video is not for everyone. By the end, you'll understand exactly what Timewave Zero is, how Terence McKenna extracted a mathematical wave from the I Ching's 64 hexagrams, why recalibrated versions of his own model point to the years we're living through right now, and what McKenna called the final singularity. Who was McKenna? Before the equation, you need to understand who built it, because Terence McKenna was not a fringe figure. He was one of the most rigorous, genuinely strange minds of the 20th century. Born in 1946 in Colorado, McKenna studied at UC Berkeley and traveled through South America and Asia, spending years among indigenous cultures who used psychoactive plants, not for escape, but as philosophical tools, refined over centuries of practice. What made McKenna different wasn't the experiences. It was what he did afterward. He went back to libraries. He cross-referenced his insights with mathematics, linguistics, and quantum physics. He was intellectually ferocious, too rigorous to dismiss, too strange to categorize. By the late 1970s, cognitive scientists and complexity theorists were quietly reading his work, not because it was comfortable, because it kept generating observations that landed. Nature loves courage. You make the commitment, and nature will respond to that. In 1971, deep in the Amazon rainforest, McKenna had an experience he couldn't explain in conventional terms, one that would take him 2 decades to translate into mathematics. And that translation started with a text written 3,000 years before he was born. If you think that sounds like mysticism dressed up as science, keep watching. Because what the numbers actually show is harder to argue with than you'd expect. Timewave theory. The idea that defined everything McKenna became was this. Time is fractal, not in a poetic sense, in a mathematical one. McKenna proposed that time itself has a structure, a wave pattern that repeats at different scales, like a coastline or a snowflake. Embedded in that wave is a variable he called novelty, the degree to which the universe generates new complexity, new connections, new configurations of matter and energy. The opposite of repetition, the opposite of habit. The core claim was radical. Novelty increases over time. The universe has been consistently, mathematically trending toward more complexity, more strangeness. And this trend has a direction, a terminal point. He called it the Timewave Zero singularity, a moment where novelty reaches such density that change becomes essentially instantaneous, where history as a process effectively ends, not because everything stops, but because everything transforms simultaneously. Not the end of the world. The end of the world as we knew it to be. McKenna was careful to distinguish this from apocalypse. This was metamorphosis. But what gave him the mathematical confidence to make this claim? An ancient oracle that by all rights should not have contained mathematics at all. And that's where the story takes its strangest turn. I Ching connection. The I Ching, the Book of Changes, is one of the oldest texts in human civilization. Dating to around 1000 BCE in China, it has been used as a divination system for 3 millennia. On the surface, it has nothing to do with mathematics, but McKenna looked at it differently. The I Ching is structured around 64 hexagrams, 6-line symbols, each line either broken or unbroken, arranged in a specific order called the King-Wen sequence. McKenna mapped the transitions between hexagrams and found a hidden numerical pattern no one had documented before. Not a coincidence pattern, a wave. When he graphed the degree of change between each sequential hexagram, the mathematical distance between consecutive states, a wave emerged with internal structure. fractal self-similarity, repeating rhythms across different scales. You have to take seriously the notion that understanding the universe is your responsibility, because the only understanding of the universe that will be useful to you is your own. What stunned McKenna was that he didn't construct this wave. He found it, already embedded in a text written before calculus existed, before graph theory, before the word fractal had ever been spoken. He and his brother Dennis spent years converting the pattern into a computational model. And when they ran it against actual human history, the results demanded a very different conversation. Novelty in history. Here is where Timewave Zero becomes harder to dismiss. When McKenna's team calibrated the wave against human history, the peaks of novelty aligned with something real. 1. The Black Death and Renaissance, 1347-1450. 2. The Scientific Revolution, 1543-1687. 3. The French Revolution and Napoleonic Era, 1789. 4. World War I and the Russian Revolution, 1914-1917. 5. The Atomic Age and Cold War onset, 1945-1962. These weren't cherry-picked after the fact. They were the peaks the wave generated independently, and they corresponded directly to the periods historians consistently identify as the most transformative in human experience. The wave wasn't predicting events. It was predicting the density of change itself. McKenna was careful about this distinction. He wasn't claiming the I Ching named specific events. He was claiming it encoded the rhythm, the fractal timing, of how novelty moves through civilization. The valleys matched equally clearly: dark ages, stagnant empires, centuries where the world barely changed. But then came the 20th century. On the time wave, the 20th century looked unlike anything that had come before it. Novelty spikes compressed into decades that would have taken centuries in earlier eras. And the compression wasn't slowing. It was accelerating towards something. What the wave showed happening next, what comes after that acceleration, is what McKenna spent the rest of his life trying to calculate precisely. The predictions. McKenna's critics always asked the same question: show us a prediction made before the event. And in at least one documented case, he came remarkably close. In lectures from the early 1990s, recordings you can still find online today, McKenna described what the time wave showed approaching in the early 2000s. He used the phrase centuries of change compressed into years. He described the emergence of communication networks dissolving national boundaries, biological disruptions, geopolitical realignments that would make previous borders look arbitrary. He was describing the internet age, before most people had ever used an email address. The wave also flagged a secondary concentration of novelty around what would become 2001. McKenna couldn't name the event. The wave doesn't name events, but he flagged the compression in recordings that predate the fact by years. If that just made you reconsider how seriously to take this equation, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring ideas that most channels won't touch. Because what comes next is the part McKenna never got to finish explaining. The original terminal point he calculated was 2012. Wrong date. Or was it? Because when researchers re-examined the calibration model after his death, they found something McKenna had privately suspected for years. The anchor point was off, and correcting it shifts the singularity to somewhere uncomfortably close to the present. Dying too soon. In April 1999, Terence McKenna had a seizure. Doctors found a glioblastoma multiforme, one of the most aggressive brain cancers known to medicine. He was 53 years old. What followed was not a quiet withdrawal. People around McKenna during his final year describe him as frantic, writing constantly, recording, working harder than he had in years. Not despite the diagnosis, but because of it. He knew time had a hard limit now, and the equation wasn't finished. He knew the calculation was incomplete, and that he was running out of time to complete it. Glioblastoma rarely allows for a long goodbye. Terence McKenna died on April 3rd, 2000. His collaborators describe his final months as intensely focused on one specific problem. The calibration error he privately believed existed in the original time-wave model. We have been to the moon, we have charted the depths of the ocean and the heart of the atom, but we have a fear of looking inward to ourselves. He left behind recordings, partial manuscripts, and a hard drive full of unfinished work. His collaborator, Peter Mayer, who built the original Timewave Zero software, has confirmed publicly that the materials contain calculations that were never fully synthesized into a publishable form. A mathematician dying mid-equation is one of history's most unsettling, unfinished sentences. The public never received the revised theory. But what exists in those remaining files changes the entire conversation about 2012, about 2026, and about what McKenna actually believed was coming. Unfinished book. McKenna had been building toward what he called the definitive mathematical treatment of Timewave Zero. Not the mystical version, not the lecture version, but a rigorous derivation that independent researchers could examine and test on their own. He wanted the equation to stand without him in the room to interpret it. That book was never finished. What exists instead are hundreds of hours of recorded lectures, partial manuscripts, and correspondence that his estate has released gradually over the years. And buried in those materials are references to something specific. He was revising the anchor. The original timewave calibration used a specific historical 0 point to anchor the wave to the 2012 date. McKenna had grown privately uncertain this was the correct reference. Late recordings and correspondence show him exploring alternative anchor points, events with different mathematical weight in the King-Wen transition matrix. Multiple researchers, working independently from McKenna's published and unpublished materials, ran their own recalibrations, changed the anchor point, and the singularity shifts forward by years. Several of those independent recalibrations, not all, but multiple with defensible mathematical reasoning, do not produce 2012 as their terminal date. They produce a window closer to the present decade. The math he never finished is still running, right now, pointing at us. What it shows for the years we are currently living through is the part that should make anyone who takes mathematical modeling seriously stop and pay attention. 2026, let's be precise about what the recalibrated time wave actually indicates for the present moment, because there is significant noise in how this gets reported online. Timewave Zero is not a prophecy. McKenna was explicit. It's a model of novelty density. It shows when change is likely to be most compressed, most rapid, most unprecedented, not which specific events will occur. What the recalibrated model shows for the mid-2020 is what McKenna described as the gradient toward zero, a period where the wave's descent becomes steep enough that the pace of events would be, by his model, essentially without historical precedent in their density of simultaneous change. Not one transformative event, an avalanche of changes that never stops accelerating. Consider the window from 2020 to the present, a global pandemic restructuring economies and social behavior in months. Artificial intelligence crossing capability thresholds in 5 years that experts had projected for 50. Geopolitical realignments across multiple major blocs simultaneously. Financial, biological, and political disruptions arriving in overlapping waves with no recovery period in between. The rate of change is measurably outpacing the human capacity to understand what is changing. McKenna's wave doesn't say 2026 is the end. It says 2026 sits near the bottom of the steepest part of the descent. What McKenna believed waited at the bottom, what he described in his final year, is what we're about to get to. And it is the most unsettling thing in his entire body of work. The final warning. Here is the part McKenna described as the hardest to communicate, the thing he kept returning to in his final year with increasing urgency, and the reason people who knew him then describe him as different. Changed. When Timewave Zero approaches its terminal point, McKenna did not predict catastrophe. He predicted something more disorienting than catastrophe. Phase shift. He used the image of a caterpillar inside a chrysalis. The caterpillar does not know it is becoming a butterfly. From inside the chrysalis, everything that defined its existence dissolves. Its body liquefies. Its structure collapses. And what emerges operates by entirely different rules. Rules that would have been incomprehensible to the caterpillar. McKenna said the timewave singularity works the same way. We are at the edge of a domain of which no human has ever had experience. His final warning, the one he repeated in his last recorded interviews, was this: the danger is not the change itself, but the absolute refusal to see that it is happening. The people most damaged by a phase transition, McKenna believed, are those who insist the old rules still apply when they no longer do, who mistake acceleration for chaos rather than recognizing it as convergence towards something new. Recognize it or don't. Do you think McKenna's final warning is genius or madness? Comment genius or insane. I need to know where you stand on this. And if this video reached you at exactly the right moment, share it with as many people as you possibly can. This truth deserves to travel as far as it can go. Math still runs. Here is the resolution to what I told you at the beginning, what McKenna shared with his closest collaborators in those final months, and what he asked them not to repeat until the time had clearly arrived. According to multiple people in McKenna's inner circle, information that has emerged gradually through interviews, recorded conversations, and published accounts over 25 years. McKenna had concluded the revised singularity point was not 2012. He believed the real bottom of the descent was somewhere in the late 2020s. He didn't have a specific year. He had a range, and he told the people closest to him, when the novelty gradient becomes impossible to ignore, when you feel the acceleration not just in news cycles, but in your own daily experience, in the pace of your own decisions and disruptions. That's when you'll know the wave is at its steepest. He asked them to tell people when it became obvious that things were moving too fast to track. The math did not die with McKenna. Peter Mayer's Timewave Zero software remains publicly available. Independent researchers continue running the equation with different calibration parameters. The algorithm does not need its author alive to keep generating output. The world is stranger than any of our theories about it. Whether this is transformation or collapse or something we have no name for yet, that is the question he died trying to answer. And right now, in the exact window his revised thinking pointed toward, we are here. The truth is stranger than anything you could make up. What Terence McKenna left behind wasn't a prophecy. It was a question, encoded in mathematics, extracted from a 3,000-year-old oracle, and left running on servers he never got to finish programming. The question is still running. The time wave doesn't tell you what happens. It tells you when the conditions for the unimaginable become unavoidable. And if the recalibrated wave is pointing at this exact window, then we are the generation standing at the steepest part of the descent. History won't remember this era as a crisis. It will remember it as a chrysalis. The real question isn't whether the equation is precisely accurate. The real question is what you do with the awareness that the world you were born into is not the world you will die in, and that the distance between those two realities is collapsing faster than anyone expected in anyone's model. McKenna spent his life studying the mathematics of change so that when the moment arrived, there would be at least some people who recognized it for what it was, not an ending, a metamorphosis. If you made it this far, comment, time wave. That's how I know you're one of the people paying attention when it matters most. The truth is stranger than anything you could make up. If this blew your mind, hit like and subscribe, because next time it gets even stranger.